Let's take a look here at the 2019 AP Micro exam question number 2. This is from set 2 as well. So let's pull it up. Okay, so this one is, we have a pretty busy looking supply and demand graph up here with a lot of different points, prices and quantities, right? So the questions are gonna, and there's also a tax involved. And they're going to ask you a number, what is the correct point we're going to be at for a lot of the things here. So we're talking about hats are produced in a perfectly competitive industry. And then the government is going to impose a per unit sales tax on hats. So they've already drawn this for you, essentially what happens because of the tax, right? So we have our initial supply and demand curve, but then because it's a per unit tax, right, that essentially shifts the supply curve, right? Not the actual supply curve, but they have it labeled up here as supply plus tax. So it's all really set up for us here, and we just have to sort of interpret. And it's a really pretty busy graph, which is you just got to kind of cut through a lot of the information, make sure you know what you're thinking about here. So let's go to part A. Using the labeling from the graphs. They're talking about using all the points right here and the correct notation. So be careful. You're paying attention to the details here. They want to know the after-tax price paid by consumers and the after-tax quantity. So what they're asking here is where does this market actually clear? What's the price and quantity when the tax is factored in? So we want to kind of ignore the initial supply curve, right? We're talking about to consumers, right? They don't know the difference. The price is the price, right? So it's including the tax. Where is this market going to clear? So you find the supply plus tax curve and then the demand curve. So they intersect at this point here, right? Which is what, S. So we come down. Our quantity should be there, and then we come across, and our price should be there. So they want to know the after-tax price and the quantity. So you would just have to say, you might want to say this in a sentence, but the answers should be P3 and Q2. And that's part 1. All right, so now I want to know the area representing the total tax revenue received by the government. Okay, so if this is the quantity we're at, this is sort of the after-tax price. So you want to say, go to the actual supply curve. This is the price that producers are going to actually receive, right? The difference there being what they remit as the tax to the government. So what you're going to take the area of this sort of rectangle here. Shade it in there, and that is the area representing the total tax revenue. There are a couple of ways you could say this. You could say, the rectangle P1, P3, SZ. You could also sort of do it mathematically, right? P3 minus P1 times Q2. That would give you the actual sort of formula to calculate this if we had values. So any sort of format of that, as long as you're getting that information across and using the right points there. All right, let's go to part B. Now assume instead that the demand for hats is perfectly inelastic at Q3, while the supply and the per unit tax remain unchanged. Okay, so this is where it's going to get a little bit messy because our graph doesn't really give us all the information we need. Well, that didn't work very well. All right, I'll just stay up here. We'll come down for the last part. All right, perfectly inelastic at Q3. So what does that mean? So essentially, they're saying, get rid of this demand curve. This demand curve no longer exists. Demand is now perfectly inelastic at Q3. Well, what does that mean? Well, you go to Q3. Perfectly inelastic means the demand curve looks something like this. So that's our, let's just put a D for our new demand curve. Perfectly inelastic mean we demand the quantity at Q3 no matter what the price is, right? We're perfectly inelastic. So, you know, whatever the price is, we're going to pay it. We need that quantity. Okay, so, and then the supply and the supply plus tax curves remain unchanged. And then they want to know, part one, will the after-tax price paid by consumers be higher, lower, or the same compared to the price in your answer to part A1? So remember, we were at initially this point, right? P3 was our initial point. So now we've changed the demand curve. So don't even look at this demand curve. And we got to go and find where supply plus tax intersects demand curve, right? So the new, in this case, when demand is perfectly inelastic at this quantity, the new intersection is going to be here, right? So now we're up at P4. So the question here, will the price paid, and that is higher, you know, you don't need to explain, but you're comparing, and, you know, we're essentially saying P4 is greater than P3. Okay. All right. Part two, will the tax revenue received by the government be higher, lower, or the same compared to the previous answer? Okay. Well, now we're up here, right? So we got to go to the supply curve. And it should be larger, right? So the quantity is going to be higher, and the price is also going to be higher. So, you know, however you want to phrase that, so this should be higher. And they do want an explanation, right? The quantity, you know, because we're perfectly inelastic, right? Quantity doesn't matter to price, right? So previously we were talking about Q2, right? So we know the quantity has increased. Q3 is greater than Q2. And not only that, this has price has increased, right? So because of this, you're going to know that the area here is going to be larger. And that's generally the case, you know, when demand is perfectly inelastic, even if the price increased, the quantity demanded is not going to change. In this case, it's actually at a higher quantity. Okay. All right, so now we want to do kind of a similar, let's see what's this question. If the demand for hats remains perfectly inelastic Q3 and the per unit sales tax is reduced, will producer surplus increase, decrease, or stay the same? Explain. Okay, so we want to know about producer surplus. So let's put our, let's redraw that inelastic. All right, so we're at Q3. Okay, producer surplus, right? So we were up at this point here. Producers receive this amount. So producer surplus is down over here, right? Essentially, let's just shade it in right there, that triangle. And right in this area, let's just go ahead, you know, was our tax revenue. And then area above, this doesn't really make sense because we have perfectly inelastic, but the area above would be consumer surplus, right? People who are willing to pay more than the price that they actually got in the market. So the question is, does producer surplus change if the supply plus tax curve comes down, right? They're talking about reducing the tax. So moving this curve back down this way. And the answer to this is it would not change. The producer surplus, so even if, let's say we came down, right? Let's move this curve down somewhat, right? The intersection would be lower. Let's just say it's at P3 here. So the price that consumers receive after the tax is now lower. But the producer surplus, right, the amount that they receive is still down at this point W. So the producer surplus has not changed. So um, as long as you say something to that effect, um, when demand is perfectly inelastic, the consumers are going to be the ones that sort of bear the burden of the tax. Now that's not the case when the demand is not perfectly inelastic, but for parts B and C, they have us considering this new demand curve. So the answer to part C is the producer surplus does not change because the price received by the sellers and the quantity do not change, right? We're still receiving, quantity is still the same and the price is still the same point. So that has not changed at all, even though this curve would shift down.